My name is Skip Rutherford. I'm Dean of the Clinton School, and welcome to another in a series of our programs. Obviously, those of you that have been to the REP programs before know exactly what I'm going to say, that we are thrilled to partner with the Arkansas Rep, have been doing so since 2010, and now we are close to 20 of these presentations where the Rep and the community come together. This was an idea of Bob Hupp's. The partnership was an idea. It was an experiment. It has obviously worked. We started out with 1 or 2 shows a year. Now we do them all. I'm trying to get him to do more shows so we can do more programs. I can't tell you what the Rep means to us, not only as a recruiting tool for our students, but as part of the cultural landscape of our city and our state. What a crown jewel it is. It is a real pleasure for us to partner and to hold these community conversations. And the producing artistic director who is beyond expectations, one of the greatest talents of our time. Please welcome Bob Hupp.
Well, it's a good crowd here today. Welcome, welcome. Thank you all for joining us. We'll begin, let me begin by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll start down there with Jess.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Jess Porter, and I'm Assistant Professor and Coordinator of Geography at UALR.
Hello, I'm John Kirk. I am Chair of the History Department at UALR and Donaghy Professor there.
I'm Shalia Atkinson, and I am in Clybourne Park. I play Francine and Lena.
Hi, I'm Jason O'Connell. I'm also in Clybourne Park. I play Carl and Steve.
Thank you. I'm Cliff Baker, and I'm directing Clybourne Park at the Rep right now. Yeah,
now, both Shalia and Jason are veterans of the Rep stage. Shalia, was Children of Eden your first production? And you've done what since then?
I was a swing in Ain't Misbehavin', and I was in Avenue Q last summer.
Right. And Jason, this is your
fourth time.
Fourth production.
I did All My Sons back in 2003, and then Sherlock Holmes, The Final Adventure, and Frost Nixon.
And Cliff, this is your first time at the Rep, I think. Yes. It's great to have Cliff back at the Rep. What's the last thing you did before Clybourne?
Sorry, I did Evita. I think
was that the last one you did? Was Evita?
Yeah, I think so.
And you know, this is the Rep's 38th year, so this is Cliff's 38th year directing plays at the Rep, and. He was a child prodigy when he started out. It's interesting to talk about Clybourne Park because it's difficult to talk about Clybourne Park. And we've had conversations at the Rep now for several months, almost a year. How do we talk about Clybourne Park? Because it's a play that most people aren't familiar with, yet it's a play that won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama a couple of years ago and the Tony Award for Best Play, which meant that it had to be on our radar screen in terms of wanting to produce it. Cliff and I saw it in New York a couple of years ago. And sometimes I see a play and go, how can we make that work at the Rep? But when I saw Clybourne Park, I felt this was absolutely a play that needed to be seen by our audiences and a play that I was eager to produce. And I don't know if Cliff was eager to direct it right off the bat, but I know we had a shared experience about its importance as a play. And of course, you always have to be scared of a play that you think is important. Because you can't act importance and you can't direct importance. And so in our conversations, how do you reconcile the sense of a play being a comedy and being about race and neighborhoods and relationships between the races? And then for me, the added bonus and why we have, you know, a very different kind of panel than we've had in the past, because we always bring actors and creative personnel, but we rarely bring historians or geographers to the conversation. And in my opinion, you can't talk about Clybourne Park and particularly its relevance to our lives and our history here without having the wonderful opportunity to talk about our history as a city. Because at the end of the day, theater is about engaging conversation. It's about opening up new worlds. And I think Clybourne Park opens up new worlds in a very entertaining way, but a very important way. I'm going to begin with Cliff, and we're going to talk a little bit about artistic life of the play first. Cliff, what is it about Clybourne Park? What are the prevailing themes? Give us a little sense of what Clybourne Park is and what drew you as an artist to the play.
Well, just to set the record straight, I remember us sitting in New York a little differently.
That's because you're older.
At the end of the show, we turned to each other, and both of us went, "God, what a fantastic play! It is so smart." And I could swear that I said, "I want to direct this show if you ever do it." But
I'm sure you
at
did.
any rate, it's brilliant. It's a brilliantly written script. The young man who wrote it, Bruce Norris, started out as an actor. He moved into playwriting and directing, and
this is his first play on Broadway, right?
It is his first.
That he won
play.
both the Pulitzer and the Tony Award in his very first effort.
That's right. And just to show that one degree of separation, when the Rep was very, very young, I was doing some guest directing at the Alley Theater in Houston, and one of the shows I did there was Crimes of the Heart, which we did at the Rep, a Beth Hindley Pulitzer Prize winner. And when I did Crimes of the Heart at the Alley, I cast a young non-equity actor and turned him equity to play the role of Barnett. That actor was Bruce Norris. So it's, it's like less than a degree of separation. The themes of the play, it is a very exciting project to work on because it is so deliciously politically incorrect. And very seldom do you get material that allows you to laugh at something that is inappropriate or that in any other context you would be going, "Oh my God, that's horrible." But in the course of this play, you're actually laughing at the dysfunctionality of our society, if you will, and our sets of values. So it's brilliantly written. It certainly deserved the Pulitzer. The themes of it are beyond racism, although racism certainly is part of the core and the heart of it. But it deals with racism in very non-traditional ways. Act 1 is set in 1959. Act 2 is set 50 years later in the same house in 2009. And that house, for Bruce Norris, became the heart of the piece. So property, if you will, bore the play. He was introduced to as a young man to Raisin in the Sun. I think he said he was 12 or 13, something like that at the time. And it forever changed him as far as the impact that theater could have. He went on to write this play, which Act 1 is the same house as the black family, the younger family that has just bought in Raisin in the Sun in an all-white neighborhood. And so Act 1 explores the white family who is the first family and why they're selling a house to an African-American family in an all-white neighborhood in Chicago. And then Act 2 is 50 years past, and the younger family has already moved out of the house. The neighborhood has started to decline, and now is going through a regentrification. And a white family is trying to buy the house, which has been, for the last X number of years, a predominantly black neighborhood. So, you know, it's a very clever structure, and whether or not you know A Raisin in the Sun, it has incredible impact and relevance. You don't have to know that is at the heart of where the playwright drew the resource for the play from. But it's secondary to the experience that you have in the theater, which is about how people relate to each other at the very basic part of it. And then against that the issues of the subtlety of racism as well as the blatantness, and certainly the whole gentrification, urbanizing kind of changes that have happened in the last 20 years are reflected in the last act. So I hope all of you have a chance to come see it. It is truly a brilliant script. Some of the language will make you sort of sit up and think, why, oh my goodness, I haven't heard that word ever in public, kind of moments. But it really is so cleverly written and structured that it deserved the Pulitzer, and the actors and I have had a blast with it.
Let me talk to our actors for a second. Now, Jason, both you and Shalea have the opportunity to say things on stage that you probably wouldn't say anywhere else.
True.
Jason, your character in the first act is the only character that is actually referenced in A Raisin in the Sun. Mm-hmm. And so you have that burden. Now, what is it? Talk to us a little bit about creating a character that many would find offensive. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a cliche in theater called you have to honor your character. That even if you're playing Adolf Hitler, you have to find something as an actor about Adolf Hitler that you can bring to life that's not just villainous.
Right.
How do you do that?
I mean, it comes back to the play. I mean, Bruce Norris wrote a brilliant play, and the character I play in the first half, Carl Lindner, he bears the brunt of he bears the weight of the more racist attitudes. I mean, at least being brought to the fore. Everybody in the act may have their own certain feelings about, you know, those who are different from them, but he's the one who feels most comfortable and confident saying them. And I think, you know, like Bob says, you have to justify your character or love your character because nobody thinks they're a villain. But the writer's done something wonderful. He introduces this character. He makes him seem a little timid and unsure and kind of funny, and he has this beautiful young wife who's hearing impaired. She's deaf. He communicates with her through sign language. We see him in some ways as a really tolerant figure. You know, he says some things that cause you to empathize with him as a human being, as a character, things I won't give away. And then he turns on the racism. And, you know, so you're primed to see him as a human being before you see him as a signifier for, you know, these attitudes. And so I found it very easy to dig into the personal aspects of what that man was going through. And also the fact, you know, that, I mean, I'm sure Bob will get to this and Shalea will talk about it too, but then in the second act I play a man of today, really, right? Set in 2009, and both of these men are, you know, white men around my age, right? Late 30s, 40 years old, and the funny thing is that even though they're completely distinct characters with no relation to each other, it's very interesting to see how the things that a man of 1959 would feel comfortable saying and opinions he would feel comfortable expressing may not be completely different from the opinions and deep feelings that a man of 2009 might have and feel. But the man of 2009 is not allowed to express those things. Or if he did, if he had a sneaking suspicion that maybe something was going on that catered to, you know, to somebody unlike him, he couldn't call them out on that without being charged as a racist. But in 1959, a person would have no compunctions about that. So that's one of the really interesting things to explore, is that how men of the same, you know, who have essentially the same, not background, but the same makeup in different times relate to the world around them in different ways. I'm going to let you.
I'm going to talk to Shalea to answer that same question, and also, and you are from Arkansas?
I'm from Conway.
And we're glad to have you back, but you're now in New York. Mm-hmm. Your character is also very different. Your connection is to the house, and both characters have a different but at the same time meaningful connection to the house. But in the first act, you play a domestic worker. The second act, you play a leader of the Homeowners Association. Are those roles, how do you approach such different roles in the same play? Or are they just facets of the same person? How do you approach that?
Initially, I think I thought of them as very different, but the more I've explored Francine and Lena, I've realized that they kind of are the same person, at least the way that I have let her develop in me and the way Cliff has allowed her to develop, Francine especially, because, you know, when you think about domestic workers, you think of, you know, present but silent. You know, they're there to perform a service. They're not an active part of the scene, but the way Act 1 plays out, Francine and her husband Albert end up being unwilling participants in this uncomfortable conversation about race and about gentrifying this neighborhood. And the way she has developed for me is that she's not just taking the information and being offended. She's being a little, you know, you kind of see her get upset about it and have an opinion about it. She can't say it, of course. That's
well,
not.
It's like it's like in first act when you're playing the domestic worker. It's like you're wearing a mask.
Right. Everything. And if you come see the play, you will see there's a lot of unspoken things happening between Francine and Albert, because we can't say, oh, absolutely not. You know, that's would not be acceptable. But I feel like Lena in Act 2 is kind of just a fast-forwarded version of the woman Francine is in her own home. The things that Lena says that she's allowed to say in 2009 as a black woman are the things that Francine would say to her husband and her children and to her church friends and her family. So I like to think that they are very similar, and it's interesting to see how far we have come in that the black woman in Act 2 kind of gets the upper hand for a chunk of it.
She gets all the good lines.
That too. So it's fun. It's fun to get to do that and to say things, a lot of things that I think, you know, and I get to say them. And there are a lot of things that Jason's character Steve says that I agree with, but that people aren't allowed to say. You know, so I like it because it's a truthful, honest look at things that we don't like to discuss. We want to just, oh, no, that's not real. Racism isn't real. I'm just gonna go back and watch, you know, Golden Girls or whatever. You know, but.
If I could just add one thing, you know, when we talk about, you know, it's a play about issues, right? And big issues, racism, and like Cliff said, it's an important piece. And as Bob said, it's an important play that is also a hysterically funny play. But it's hard to communicate that when you start talking about issues and you know, things like that. But the truth is, what I think this play, I think the DNA of this play descends from, and I talked about this yesterday, Shalia and I did a television interview. It reminds me of my favorite television show of all time, which is All in the Family. It feels very much like that. It has that DNA, that what Norman Lear did so brilliantly in the 70s with bringing up these issues, very, very serious topics, things that you weren't allowed to really talk about, and then it was on the TV screen every week, and they were real arguments, real issues. Strong language, not as strong as ours, but strong language, but hysterically funny, and you could empathize with every character on that stage or in that scene. You know, the people who held the same views as you and the people who did not hold the same views as you. You could see the humanity in each of them, and I think this play has quite a bit of that.
And of course, you know, in addition to creating the artistic life of the play, we are also interested in how these themes that seem on the surface very distant, Chicago, 1959, how can they relate to our experience, our shared experience in Little Rock? And one of the things that allows us to do that is our great professors, our scholars from UALR, who have done so much in-depth research on this very topic. It would be foolish of us at the Rep to gloss over that or to ignore the fact that we have a resource in our community that gives us context. How did what happened to the characters in Clybourne Park, did that happen in Little Rock? Is some of it relevant? Not relevant. So John and Jess have been good enough to join us, and before I turn it over to them, I want to show a brief film. It's basically an interview with the two of them, because we know that if you see it on film, it's much more meaningful than hearing from them in person. This is a video that Angel Galloway put together, which I think is excellent, and we're using it as promotional material for our website. So Angel, why don't you watch this brief film.
Our city is, in some ways, not unlike a lot of other cities in America. We've undergone a number of transitions in our city, but we also have our own unique story.
I don't think people really realize how Little Rock got to look the way it did today. Many people, I think, assume it's there because it's natural, because that's just the way it developed. Because, one line you could say is that, well, whites just live in areas with other whites because they feel like it, and blacks just live in areas with blacks because that's the way they feel. They don't really understand that a lot of activism has taken place to actively create and construct those neighborhoods. They didn't happen naturally. They were man-made, very literally man-made, and were established that way, and were consciously planted and perpetuated in that way. So it's not by chance, it's not by circumstance, it's very self-conscious. The city very self-consciously, geographically segregated itself from the 1950s onwards. The only way you really change them, as Little Rock has seen, is if you condemn them and tear them up and bulldoze them. Then they're gone. It's proved a very effective and very enduring tool to ensure racial separation in Little Rock along geographical lines. I'm John Kirk, and I'm a Donaghy Professor and Chair of the History Department.
I'm Jess Porter, and I'm Assistant Professor of Geography in the History Department here at UALR. We are working on research that will help us better understand the spatial manifestations of change in Little Rock over time, particularly from a racial standpoint. So we're going to be able to see how neighborhoods changed and parallel that timeline with developments and policy that were happening in Little Rock.
From the 60s onwards, really, you start to see a real sprawl in Little Rock. And Little Rock has become known as one of the most sprawling cities in the United States. So its area has expanded enormously as it's expanded in its population. So that's one of the factors. But there's also a kind of microclimate operating within there in which, as that expansion took place, it was consciously racialized. And it was done through slum clearance, urban renewal, and specific African-American neighborhoods were often targeted for destruction, and they were bulldozed, and then those residents relocated into public housing which was predominantly built in the south and east of the city. And in Little Rock, what you see is the emergence of a city that was once a lot more integrated than it is today. And you go from residential patterns, at least, that were much closer in neighborhoods, to residential patterns that become much more dispersed, that the African-American population moves further and further out to the east, or is moved further and further out into the east through slum clearance projects and urban renewal.
Certainly, many people had the experiences that we see in the living room and Clybourne Park happened in living rooms in Little Rock, without question. And we have opportunities that present themselves for us to think differently based upon what we can learn from the past and perhaps make different choices that will lead us to a different urban landscape.
So what you really see, I think, in the second act of Clybourne Park is how historical consciousness is crucial to having that dialogue.
You can see these hard divisions in our city, and instead of when we map it out and see so many stark contrasts of black and white when we look at income, when we look at race, I'd like to see more shades of gray.
John, you talk in this brief film about that was sort of a deliberate process, that it wasn't accidental that our neighborhoods took the shape that they took and that they have taken and continue to take. And in Clybourne Park, we see a similar, although it's not overtly stated in the play that there was some great hand at work shaping these neighborhoods. And Clybourne Park is specifically about one family, one African-American family moving into an all-white neighborhood. But it opens up the door to so many other issues relative to real estate. Talk a little bit about, and I know you're familiar with Clybourne Park, but talk a little bit about how Little Rock changed, why it changed, and when it began.
Well, Little Rock moved from being a very compact city, downtown areas, from around the 1940s, and from the 1950s onwards became a much more sprawling city. It had much more sprawl and became much more geographically segregated as that sprawl expanded. And in the 1940s, you still have downtown areas of what they call salt and pepper residents, that is blacks and whites living in close proximity, mixed blocks, and blocks in which African American residents and white residents were close to one another. And in 1949, the government passed the Housing Act, which tried across the South, across the United States, to beautify American cities, to modernize American cities. And that provided funds for so-called slum clearance and urban renewal. And those programs, particularly in the South, were often used as ways to redefine cities and the way that they looked. And in Little Rock, as in many other southern cities, a lot of the time, African-American housing stock was defined as being a slum, even often, sometimes, arguably, when it wasn't. And so whole blocks were demolished and new housing projects built, and those residents moved into there, a lot of them in the east and south end of the city. So you have a physical separation. Houses and blocks and neighborhoods are literally ripped apart, bulldozed completely, and those residents moved, relocated to somewhere else in the city. One of the classic urban renewal projects, for example, is in West Rock, which is at the foot of Cantrell Hill today, which used to be an all African-American community. And now, if you went there, you wouldn't recognize any of that former identity of the place. So identities of places and neighborhoods were completely erased and reconstructed from the 1950s onwards as these slum clearance and urban renewal plans were put into process. And as Little Rock sprawled, that exaggerated the racial patterns more and more. So you move from a downtown area, which is very close together, in which African Americans and whites live close to one another, to a city that sprawls further and further apart, and which neighborhoods become more and more completely racially identifiable as blocks of white areas of residence and blocks of black areas of residence.
And Jess, what have you got up on the screen there? What are we looking at?
What we're looking at here is a map of population and sort of the central core here of Little Rock, bordered by the railroads. And this is what the ethnic patterns look like in 1950. On the left-hand side, you have African-American population, and the right-hand side's white population. And what you see is neighborhoods in 1950 that are predominantly black or white and are within a couple blocks of one another. Whereas today, if we look at the general pattern, and I'm going to back up here in a big way, to the 2010, this is citywide, and again, African American on the left and white population on the right. And instead of people being within a few blocks of one another now, predominantly the population is within miles of one another. It's awfully hard to have an understanding of the other if you don't come in contact with them on a daily basis. So that's one of the real striking contrasts. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to jump back to something that John mentioned a moment ago. And this is, beginning in 1950, the Housing Authority started to identify areas for slum clearance and renewal. And in a report by the Little Rock School District in 1957, the areas, I hope you can see here, that are outlined in blue are areas, again, in that central core area that were identified for clearance. Now, by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, there's 9 of these projects that have gone forward. And if we take a look and overlay that map that I just showed you of the 1950 population, you can see which areas have been selected. That's the African American population, and the blue outlines are the areas that have been identified for clearance and relocation of residents.
Who is responsible for making those decisions?
The Little Rock Housing Authority was responsible for making those decisions, and it put this plan together. And many of those officials were called to testify in the ongoing school desegregation cases, particularly in the 1980s. And they, admitted that this was their design and this was their plan, and they consciously set out to create a more racially divided city. So it's kind of, it's there in black and white in court testimony and court evidence. So it's not like this was done in secret. This was done above the board, and people were conscious of exactly what they were doing at the time.
One of the things that Clybourne Park talks about is how, about how real estate agents worked to help shape or reshape neighborhoods. Can you offer some examples about, there is no real estate agent per se in the play, but the real estate agent's presence is felt throughout, particularly the first act, right, as this force who was really sort of amoral, just there to make money. Not really, it wasn't doing it for racist reasons, or maybe there were underlying racist reasons, but it was really about making money. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about Little Rock's experience, if there was any, in terms of consciously shaping neighborhoods for economic reasons or through sort of real estate conversations?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are several practices that went on in Little Rock as in other places. One of the classic ways of profiteering from this among real estate agents was the so-called practice of blockbusting, which meant that you had an African-American block of housing, and what you would do is move a white family or white resident in, a black person into a white residential block, and all the whites would move out. So what would happen is that as a real estate agent, if you could break up that block of housing, you could get whites to move out and move out further west and sell them homes and properties at higher prices further west. And then you can move African-American families into those homes, and given the limited housing stock, that would mean you could charge a premium price for those properties to African-Americans. So you can make a profit at both ends of this game. You can make a profit on African-Americans, and you can make a profit on building new homes for whites as they shifted. So keeping the housing market in flux, of course, benefits real estate agents. There's also the practice of steering, so-called, that happened in Little Rock, where real estate agents, when a new family came into town, if they had an African-American client, they would only show them houses in African-American neighborhoods, and they wouldn't show them houses in white designated neighborhoods at all. If whites came into the city, then whites would be shown areas of residence in white areas of residence and not shown areas in African-American parts of the town. So they could steer clients towards particular areas and, again, perpetuate the racial divisions in the city. Right. And there's a practice called redlining also, in which mortgage lenders refuse to lend loans to African-American families to buy in certain areas. And the term redlining comes from the fact that in certain places, red lines in ink were drawn on maps around certain areas and said, we don't loan to African-Americans in these neighborhoods. So, by the collusion of mortgage brokers and real estate agents, along with agents of the city of Little Rock and the way they planned it, all these things worked in tandem to produce pretty effectively a more racially separate city.
I promised Cliff that every 15 minutes I would say, Clybourne Park is a comedy.
It's a comedy, I swear. I know none of this is funny, but in the context of the play, you will be laughing.
And this is the thing, I made this comment last night, and I think it bears repeating. We know that comedy is a tool we use to express things that are sometimes uncomfortable to say and uncomfortable to express. And so I think that the playwright's genius in this instance is using comedy to make very significant points. And I think that we don't want to lose sight of the fact that I think in the Arkansas Times is running an article about the play that came out today, and I think the headline of the article is A Spoonful of Sugar, which is an appropriate way to think about a play like Clybourne Park. We find it funny. We find ourselves laughing. We stop ourselves and say, I probably shouldn't be laughing at that. And then we realize that the humor reveals a deeper truth. And that's what great comedy does, and that's what great comics do. And that's a great way to experience theater. I want to open it up for questions. There are a lot of you, and we've got, with Jess and John and our actors and Cliff, we can really kind of field a wide range of questions. And so what do you guys want to talk about? What's on your mind? What questions do you have? Yes, ma'am. And they're going to bring you a mic.
Since I've lived the era that has just been explained, I want to ask, particularly John, who studied so much, where do we go from here after we have this mental health therapy called comedy, and after we have this political analysis, and when we take in consideration three things. One is the integration of families as it relates to the DNA 50 years from now. And then when we think in terms of the time that we were talking about in the 50s, what percent of that population was native Arkansans, and what we have today are immigrants who have come here, not immigrants from another country, but immigrants from other parts of the state. John, where do you see, after this therapy, after this mapping, after this profiteering, and all of us have relatives that we can't tell on the surface what race you belong to, but we all live in that. Is it class that's going to discriminate, or will it be DNA?
Well, thank you. As always, good questions, and a lot of them. I will, I think what's important in the initial sense, as you suggest, is that we have this conversation. Because I think a lot of times we don't have this conversation. I think there are many people in the city, and as you point out, a lot more people in the city are not from Arkansas, not from Little Rock, and move in here, and are disconnected from the history of the city and the historical consciousness of the city. But even those who lived through it, I think, don't truly appreciate what happened and what went on. In some ways, coming from the outside helps to sort of be beyond that and kind of look from the outside in and see what happened in those kinds of ways. But it's important to know what happened and to have a rooting in historical consciousness and to understand in a clear way exactly why the city got to look the way it got to look today, and understand the processes that happened and understand what the conversation is. So I think this is a really important start. If you like, you want to call it therapy, then it's a start, right, to understand and have a common sense of exactly what happened and why it got to the way it did today. As to how to change it, that's a lot more complex, right? That needs a lot more discussion. But, it's going to be a different way than it was achieved, of course, because what happened in the 1950s and 60s to create these segregating neighborhoods is now unconstitutional. You're not allowed to do that anymore. You couldn't invasively do the kinds of things that were done to the black community now. You couldn't say, for example, let's bulldoze Chenal Valley and move all those people downtown, which is kind of almost the equivalent of what happened in the 1950s and 60s. So it's politically inexpedient to do, and that's not going to happen. So it's going to be a much more slower and gradual process. But one of the things that we can look towards, I guess, is the gentrification of downtown neighborhoods and the appeal of living downtown, which is still in transition in Little Rock. It's still, in a kind of transitional phase. We don't know which way it's going to go. But the opportunity, I think, at least, of having people living close to one another again and making that attractive and living in downtown neighborhoods, I think, often by its nature increases the diversity and increases the interaction between different kinds of people. So I think that move back downtown and those, that kind of shift that you see in lots of cities has the potential, at least, to bring people in greater connection with one another again. But, and this is a whole different subject, but, a lot of this has always been related to schools, too. I think the end of school desegregation litigation that we've seen in the last couple of weeks opens up a new chapter in that as well. I think neighborhoods and schools and what happens to the public school system is going to be very much related to what we see happen in neighborhoods and how they grow and how they look and how they're defined as well. So I think we're living in a really fascinating new chapter of this whole story. And there are so many moving parts to it. There are so many different variables that it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. But certainly we're in a period where one end of the chapter has come and a new one's been opened with downtown, with the end of school desegregation, litigation, all those kinds of things. So I think all those things are going to factor in. And it's a fascinating time to be here. But it's also a fascinating time to talk about this and know where we are and how we got here before we start to move forward again in a way that is, again, going to fundamentally shape the city potentially for the next 50, 100 years.
Let's take it over to Jess, and he's put a new slide up there. It's that
This is just a slide that shows the pie chart on the left is the ethnic breakdown of our community. And we're not quite a 50-50 community, but about as close as you'll find around the country. And then all the other pies you see on the map are the high schools in town. And you have the pies that have blue labels are the public high schools in the Little Rock School District, and the ones that have the green labels are the private schools. And if you can't see the key, the purple parts of the pie represent white attendees, and the red parts of the pie represent African American attendees. Now, I'm not showing you anything that you don't know already, that the public schools are predominantly African American, and the white predominant schools are to the north and to the west and are predominantly private. Just to add on to what John said about the schools, I think this is perhaps maybe the most important issue at moving forward. And we do have a lot of moving ground underneath our feet right now. But I was at a school meeting 2 nights ago, and as I listened to the questions that people asked, it was clear that they were not historically informed about our community. And for some people to ask the questions that they did and not know the history of being disenfranchised in this community, of being moved basically effectively out of the city proper, not having a transportation network to be a part of the larger economic community. You've got to know that history in order to move forward, in my opinion. So as we were just saying, talking about this, I think, is a big first step that I think it's required reading for all citizens of Little Rock.
Other questions? Next question. Yes, ma'am. She's going to bring you a mic.
Hi, since nobody else raised their hand, I've been writing. Number one, John, where are you from?
I'm from England.
I figured as much because he didn't have the accent. I'm a transplant myself. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and what is going on here and what has gone on here has gone on all over the United States in the majority of the big cities, with the redlining, with the not letting or not permitting to buy in different neighborhoods. Little Rock is not a lot different. I'm wondering, in a question form in a sense, is, excuse me, the school segregation, did that have anything to do with it when Central High was, you know, when they had the big thing down here concerning Central High? And some of the notes that I wrote was, we still have the hidden racism. It has not gone away, but it can go away if we had more discussions like this. How do we get people to sit down and talk to each other? Like I said, I was raised in the North, and I couldn't understand how come kids couldn't go to school together. Because up there in 57, I went to school with white kids. You know, we got along. My best friend was Elvira Ciuffalini. And my name was Jean Coleman at the time. So I just couldn't understand it. And I guess it's hard, like you said, if we don't know our history, it makes it extremely hard to not repeat it.
Gene, I want to throw in here because you brought up something. I live downtown in the Governor's Mansion area, which, as you know, or most of you know, has gone through this exact displacement of different people. And I had the impression, the insidiousness of racism is amazing to me, because I had the impression, I'm a raging liberal, that Little Rock was ahead of the curve, that Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit didn't grapple with the race issues in the kind of confrontive, out-front way that Little Rock did, which I thought opened up conversations and a community crossover. All this time, I've been so proud, and when I talk to somebody from Chicago, I go, well, we went through that a long time ago. You guys are just now facing it. And the fact of the matter is, it's become very apparent. These two guys depressed the hell out of me. But no, it became very apparent that I'm kidding myself. That yes, I happen to live in a diverse neighborhood where there's all kinds of ethnicity. It's not just black and white, and there's a certain part of me that has assumed that we've moved to that place at a faster speed than northern cities. The fact of the matter is we haven't, and it took this play to kind of open my eyes to that, because I've always been very proud of Little Rock's fight for rights, if you will, that started with Central High, and I thought started a healing process. First, the eruption happened, then the conversations and a healing. But the fact of the matter is that we are faced with the dilemma ongoingly. And Shalia's character in the play says, my God, we've been in this conversation for 4 decades. So in Act 2, the conversation is being confronted, and in a very funny way.
Yeah, Joyce. She'll bring you a mic.
Thank you so much. And I was so excited to hear this conversation today. When I was teaching school, I actually taught A Raisin in the Sun, and so to see the son or daughter of A Raisin in the Sun is really great. I think this is a comment I'd want you all to comment about. When I was teaching that play and just talking anything about racism, it was just so incredibly clear. The students, of course, had no idea about the history of Little Rock in particular. The necessity of intentionality, to me, just begs to be acknowledged, because intentionality is exactly what we use to get to where we are. And yet, today, when we start to be intentional about addressing this, people start saying to us, it's affirmative action, or you're trying to tell people how to live. And then in the next breath, we'll say, but our next generation is going to change it, but we never teach them this backstory so they can. So I just like your comments about, what are your thoughts about how do we begin to work with that next generation and to be intentional? Like when you look for a home and you say you want integrated schools, but you intentionally go someplace where it's not even possible, but you want neighborhood schools. I'd like to hear your comments about that.
I'll start. I think you look to the arts. That's one of the places you look first, and it's one of the first things that is consistently cut in the education system. Yeah. But if students were brought to the rep on a regular basis, fortunately some schools do that still, but I really think that there is the possibility lives in the arts, and that the healthiest cities are the ones that foster and embrace that and realize that creativity is an answer to, is the pathway, the solution to these kind of social problems. Now, I know that sounds oversimplistic, but all you have to do is take a look at the REP's programming, and you will see more crossover in ethnicity than in any other dynamic I can think of in this city. So much like the REP laid claim to downtown and said, this deserted street is exactly where we want to be, because we're going to help lead this city in a different direction. And it was intentional, and it's one of the biggest gaps right now in education is arts funding. And that opens up the conversations. That's what gives you Raisin in the Sun and Clybourne Park follow-up. So.
But it's safe to be intentional in the arts,
because the arts in many ways are non-threatening. Much more difficult to be intentional in public policy, because then you open up so many cans of worms and so many political agendas that it's shocking to me, but I guess we should never be surprised. But nonetheless, the arts at least provide that opportunity, and sometimes because we fly so low under the radar screen, and mainly because nobody thinks we're really a threat to anybody's well-being or security, that the arts can, in fact, engage in that conversation, sometimes more effectively, because the arts at least give us a forum for gathering in a communal way. And there aren't too many other activities that we can gather in a communal way where we can also have tough conversations. Because if we're enjoying ourselves, that invites us to have those tough conversations. So I think Cliff is right. I think it's Pollyanna of us to think that's going to change the world, but a little bit at a time.
Can I just say very quickly about what you say, and you said about the conversation? I think that we have to be willing to step into what we don't know and to step into what might be scary, because I think it's very easy to live in a world where if you don't experience something, you don't think it's real. I've had a lot of people tell, because with my generation, social media is huge. So you'll see an article about something about racism or whatever, and friends are saying, well, wait, don't we live in a post-racial society? No. But if you are, a white male that lives only around other white males, of course you have no form of reference for what's going on. But if you say, okay, wait a minute, this is still happening. I don't know what it is I've said this before, to have a peanut allergy, but that doesn't mean it's not real to someone. So I can't pull on my blinders and say, no, eat that peanut butter sandwich, you're gonna be fine. So I think we have to be able to open our eyes and ingest these things and then have a conversation that might be a little uncomfortable, because that's how we grow. That's the only way you're going to develop, is if you get uncomfortable on occasion. And we have these conversations. We put our kids in schools with kids that don't look like them, and we show them movies that people don't look like them. So that's how you have to start, but it's slow.
Walk in somebody else's shoes.
Amen.
I'll come back here and then I'll come up to you, Jim. Yes, sir. Here comes a mic for you.
I grew up in Harrison, and we had a particular situation there. And as a young boy, I remember bellhopping in a local hotel, and a fine car rolled into town. There was an African-American chauffeur there, and so there was no place for the African-American chauffeur to stay. So I saw him down to the basement and set out a cot for him, and that's where he stayed. And that was there was a trip to Little Rock for me was terrific. I mean, I had an aunt down here, and I would come down in the summers and stand down on Main Street, and just the scene of that was marvelous to me. To get on the bus and ride, and the African Americans were different, and it was a different situation for me. But more to the point now, do you think that the other ethnic groups, like the Hispanics and the Asians that are coming in, does that change the scene just a little bit as well? Does that, maybe as our sensibilities and sensitivities being enlarged, just by that fact, and we're becoming a little bit more ethnically tolerant or something? I don't know.
John, do you have any evidence to talk about that?
Well, I think, Little Rock is still predominantly African-American white, and the other kind of minority groups kind of make that ground in the middle. But, it reminds me of something I was talking about the other day that intrigues me, that when we talk about schools, segregated schools in Arkansas, I was looking at a report, and white schools, notionally white schools in Arkansas, have always been the most diverse schools, because a black school was where black kids went, and a white school is where everybody else went. So if you were Japanese, if you were Korean, if you were Chinese, if you were Eskimo, I mean, all those are listed in the reports. You went to white school. So, you know, schools talk about being diverse now, and they include kind of Asians and, you know, to kind of enhance the diversity. But white schools have always been diverse. White schools have been more diverse than black schools. It's the black schools that were, if you want to put it in those terms, more racially pure. Black schools were just about black schools. White schools were everybody else. So schools have always been diverse. White schools have always been diverse. So I think, you know, the racial divide in terms of what we call it in terms of black and white still is very profoundly important in the city because the black population has continued to grow. And in the last census, Little Rock for the first time in the 20th, after the 20th century became a predominantly non-white city. So that growth in population, and it's 40-something% white, 40-odd% something African American, still mean that divide and those kind of clear lines are the most predominant racial patterns in the city, I think. And those expanding groups will make a difference perhaps over time, but at the moment I think African American white is the clear divide that still exists in the city.
Jim, you get the last question.
Yes, that puts the pressure on me. So I would like to loudly commend Cliff Baker. I happen to have been in the early group that considered moving the theater from Kavanaugh, a storefront in Kavanaugh, the neighborhood theater or whatever you called it at the time, down to a broken down, abandoned church on the east side of MacArthur Park. And this had been in the mid-70s, 75, 6, something like that. And I see one other original board member of the theater, Ansha Briggs, sitting there. Maybe there are others here. But it took Cliff's vision and courage and sense of encouragement to all of us who were on the board to say, look, this is a real opportunity. Not only is there this old church that can be adapted to a theater, and for those of you who consider church as theater, that might not be such a stretch. But in any case, it took Cliff's vision and leadership to make that happen. And we were just a band of merry, naive, well-meaning, younger people who were
much younger.
So, and that's the same kind of vision that it took the Clinton Center to locate down in this part of town. So that part of what creates the bridge between communities is people, individuals, who can seize an opportunity, whether it's a real estate opportunity or a social opportunity, to bring people together to move a city in a new direction of development. And I want to commend Cliff, I want to commend the Clinton Center for being leaders in that process, which hopefully will continue.
Thank you, Jim. And that's a very good way to wrap up our conversation today. Really, it's just the beginning of a conversation. You know, it's often said that theater as an experience isn't necessarily charged with providing you answers, but it is charged with raising important questions. And I think Clybourne Park embodies that sense of question in a way that we find enjoyable and engaging. And so I hope you will all come down and experience Clybourne Park for yourself. Tell your neighbors and friends to come down and experience Clybourne Park. See what you think about the questions we've raised here today. This is one of the most sort of intellectually diverse conversations we've had to come to talk about a play. But that's what is wonderful about Clybourne Park. So I want to thank all of our panelists. I especially want to thank Skip and Nikolai and everybody here at the Clinton School for providing this opportunity for us to come together and talk about theater in the daylight, which is a rare and exciting experience for us. Thank you all so much for being here.